Patrick Wardle, Synthetically breaking macOS. macOS suffers from a subtle code signaling flag that allows unprivileged attackers to programmatically interact with the UI. Such, it's trivial to sidestep Apple's anti-click protection to generically bypass many Mojave's foundational security mechanisms with a single synthetic click.
All right, aloha and welcome to my presentation. Today I'm stoked to be talking about synthetically breaking macOS. So my name is Patrick Wardle. I'm the creator of Objective-C and previously a co-founder of Digita Security. As Digita was recently acquired by Jamf, I now work at Jamf. All right, so first up, let's get to know our target. That is, what we'll be targeting, what we'll be breaking today. Now, Apple does an amazing job of both explaining and touting this, so let's watch a recent clip from their keynote.
Next, I'd like to talk about security and privacy. You know, one of the reasons that people choose Apple products is because of our commitment to security and privacy. And we believe that your private data should remain private. Not because you've done something wrong or that you have something to hide, but because there can be a lot of sensitive data on your devices, and we think you should be in control of who sees it. Now, again, we protect your information.
So basically, they're explaining their new security and privacy features. So I'll kind of, because the audio isn't coming through, we'll talk through it. So he's talking about how apps now have extra layers of security before they can access. For example, if the terminal wants to access your contacts, there's now an alert or a pop-up that the user has to approve. He's saying there's API-level protections. For example, when an application or a piece of software wants to access the user's location, for example, your contacts, your photos, or calendars, he's now saying it's also been expanded or extended to other sensitive parts of the operating system. So these are the lists now of access prompts that will be displayed when an app or perhaps a piece of malware tries to access these sensitive pieces of information. And this is all new to Mojave. All right, so no more audio in the talk. So now we're not here just to watch clips from Apple's presentations. Instead, we're going to talk about how to break macOS via synthetic or programmatic clicks. So first, we'll look at specific parts of the operating system that we can target and ideally bypass with a synthetic click. For example, many of the examples we just saw in the keynote presentation. Then we'll highlight previous bypasses that abuse synthetic clicks on older versions of macOS. And then also look at Apple's responses and their defenses against these older attacks. Finally, we'll talk about a flaw that affected the most recent version of macOS that allowed for the generation of synthetic clicks. So now let's first look at what we can break via synthetic or programmatically generated clicks. So on Mojave, many, if not most, sensitive actions now require explicit user approval. This is what Craig was talking about in the keynote. So imagine a hacker has gained remote access to a Mac system, or perhaps the user has inadvertently infected themselves with some Mac malware. Now, this malware or the attacker probably wants to do things like load a kernel extension, run an Apple script, grab the user's photos, determine the user's location, or perhaps turn on the mic or the webcam. On Mojave, these will all now generate alerts. Specifically, the operating system will actually intercept and block that action, display an alert to the user, and then will only allow the action to proceed if the user clicks OK or Allow. Obviously, this is very good for the user, right? The security of the system is increased. For the hackers or for the malware, this can pose a problem. So now let's look a little bit closer at some of these security or privacy actions that will generate such alerts. So first up, we have kernel extension loading. Now, on recent versions of macOS, users now have to explicitly allow the loading of kernel extensions or kexts. This is designed to thwart an attack where a sophisticated adversary can bring a validly signed, but vulnerable third-party kernel extension to a system that they control, then load this kernel extension. It'll be allowed to load because it's validly signed. Then the attacker or the malware can exploit this known vulnerability in that buggy kernel extension to gain arbitrary code execution in ring 0, effectively bypassing macOS's kernel code signing requirement. Now, I talked about this attack a few years ago at DEF CON, and interestingly, this was also used, albeit on the Windows platform, by the Slingshot APT group. Next up is mic and webcam access. Starting with Mojave, if any program wants to access the microphone or the webcam, this action will be blocked by the operating system until the user explicitly approves this via an alert, which we can see on the slide. This, again, is a great idea from a security point of view, as lots of Mac malware has targeted the mic or the webcam. Some recent versions or recent examples include Hacking Team's RCS implant, and also Fruit Fly, which unfortunately spied on children for over a decade via the webcam on their Mac computers. As highlighted in the Apple keynote, which we saw at the beginning of this talk, macOS also attempts to protect the user's privacy by blocking unauthorized actions and alerting the user, and then requesting approval via a pop-up. The goal, of course, is to block malware, hackers, or even shady or surreptitious applications from gaining access to the user's call records, messaging, and geolocation. It's important to note, on older versions of macOS, this access was allowed with no alert. So again, this is a new feature that Apple has recently introduced. Another new security feature in Mojave is that it blocks various administrative actions when they are performed via the terminal. So for example, if you now try to add a cron job, and you can imagine a hacker trying to do this, perhaps to persist a piece of malware, this will be blocked. Again, as we can see on the slide, an alert will be shown to the user that the user must explicitly approve before the action is allowed. Also new to Mojave, the operating system will now alert anytime an Apple script command is executed if that Apple script command tries to interact with a remote process. From a security point of view, again, this is a great idea. For example, as we can see on the slide, here's a snippet of Apple script from a rather prolific piece of adware that attempted to locally inject JavaScript via AppleScript into the user's browser session. Once the JavaScript was executing in the context of the user's browser session, it would obviously have access to passwords and their browsing data. Luckily, for users now, on Mojave, this injection will be blocked because, again, it doesn't allow AppleScript to now interact with remote processes. Now, we also need to talk about third-party security tools, because such tools are very common with a lot of Mac users as they provide an additional layer of security, and thus are actually quite likely to detect a hacker or a piece of malware on the system. Some examples of these tools include detecting persistence, or a firewall that will alert anytime it detects unauthorized network access. Now, these security tools, when they detect an unauthorized action, generally display an alert to the user, saying, hey, I blocked this outgoing network attempt, or I blocked this, perhaps, piece of malware persisting on the file system. From the hacker's point of view, wouldn't it be great if they could programmatically interact with these alerts and simply click Allow to authorize the action? Of course, that would be great. So we've illustrated that basically everything worthwhile on Mojave will now be blocked and generate an alert that the user must explicitly approve. So if we put on our black hats and think like a hacker, our goal now is to locally bypass all of these with a single click. And the beauty of this approach is if we find a way to synthetically or programmatically interact with these alert boxes, we can generically bypass all of these security and privacy mechanisms. That is to say, the UI is the common element that joins them all together. So in a way, it's perhaps the weakest link. So the power of these synthetic clicks, the ability to interact with security and privacy alerts, has long been realized. So now we're going to briefly look at attacks that leverage such synthetic clicks on older versions of macOS. So these are previous attacks, as well as also highlight Apple's patches and defenses against these attacks. First up, let's look at AppleScript and synthetic events. So all the way back in 2011, there was a neat piece of Mac malware named Devil Robber that dumped keychains to steal passwords. So once it infected the system, what it would do, it was access the keychain and try to gain all the information in the keychain, passwords, private code signing certificates, everything. So the way it did this is pretty straightforward. It invoked the built-in security command and passed the dump keychain command line flag. Now, this would generate a keychain access prompt. Even all the way back then, Apple said, OK, we're going to really double check that the user is OK with this new program accessing everything in the keychain. So what the malware would do, though, is once this alert had been generated and was displayed on the screen, it would simply send a programmatic mouse click, a synthetic click, via AppleScript to click on the always allow button. This would obviously then approve the malware to access the keychain. And this required no special privileges, no password, and gave the malware access to everything in the keychain because, again, it could generate a synthetic click to always click allow. Another piece of Mac malware that abused synthetic clicks was Fruitfly. Specifically via various Apple APIs, it provided a way for a remote attacker to interact with the UI of an already infected system. For example, to move the mouse, and of course, to generate clicks. So as we can see on the slide, this means the remote attacker, the hacker, can, for example, dismiss security alerts remotely. That's really great. Not something we've seen a lot in malware, but it's kind of a neat capability that's built directly into this piece of code. Adware, which is becoming ever more common, ever more prolific on macOS, also has a history of abusing synthetic events. So here, for example, we have Genio. And Genio attempts to install itself as a malicious browser extension. So it can gain access to the user's browser session, cookies, passwords, credentials, etc. If we reverse engineer its binary code, we can discover or uncover methods such as get pop-up position or click on install button. Wonder what these do, right? So if we take a closer look, and I've dumped some of the disassembly on the slide, we can see that these methods will get the location of a pop-up and then send a synthetic mouse click to the pop-up to click on the allow button. This effectively allows it to be installed. macOS will now block an alert if someone tries to install a browser extension. So the malware says, OK, I'm going to allow this alert, but I'm going to programmatically just click allow. So I basically am approving myself, effectively bypassing Apple's security posture at that time. Now, Apple obviously had to do something about these attacks, and good news, they did. So their first attempt was to instruct the system to filter out or to ignore unauthorized synthetic clicks. So now, if a random program tries to generate a synthetic or programmatic mouse click, say to a keychain access prompt, macOS will detect that this mouse click is not coming from the user. Instead, it's been programmatically generated and will ignore this. So from a technical point of view, this is done by checking, amongst other things, the PID of the process. If the PID is PID 0, this means the event is coming from the kernel. And if you think about it, in the kernel, that's where the mouse drivers, the kernel extensions, live. So this likely means that this is coming in from the user via physically clicking the mouse. Of course, though, if a random piece of software, an application, or malware generates a synthetic click, the PID will belong to that process and won't be PID 0, and thus will be ignored. Besides a simple PID check, there's also some other checks going on. First, we noticed if we try to now generate a synthetic click via our own application, we can see that there is an error message that's displayed in the log files. What I did was I grepped the file system looking for the binary that would generate this error message. And I found this, and then this allowed me to figure out exactly what the system was checking. So in short, as we can see on the slide, in disassembly, macOS will invoke a function called cgx sender can synthesize events, which calls into the kernel to check if that process has been approved or has specifically an entitlement that allows it to generate synthetic events. If it doesn't, for example, it's a new application or a piece of malware, the kernel will come back and say, no, this application does not have the authority to generate these events, and this will either be blocked or generate an alert that the user has to approve. Now, unfortunately for Apple and for users, it was rather trivial to bypass this by simply finding a way for the system to generate the event or the click on our behalf. Because recall, Apple was not yet fully blocking synthetic events. They were basically saying we're only allowing clicks that come from the system. So if we can figure out a way to coerce the system to generate these arbitrary programmatic mouse clicks for us, instead of doing it directly ourselves, these would still be allowed. So one example or way we could do this was via something called mouse keys. So in macOS, there's something called mouse keys, which allows one to generate synthetic mouse clicks via synthetic keyboard events. Effectively, it turns the keyboard into the mouse. So when this is enabled, for example, when you press the I key, this will be translated into a left mouse click. So it turns out the system still allows us to generate synthetic keyboard clicks. With mouse keys being turned on, these would be translated by the system to a mouse click, and then when the system went to examine these mouse clicks, it would appear that they came from the system because the system was the one doing the translation of the clicks from the keyboard to the mouse. So they would be allowed. So this meant even with Apple's previous security defenses, we could still generate arbitrary synthetic clicks that would allow us to click on, for example, security prompts. Apple patched that, which is good. Turns out, though, there was another way to bypass Apple's protection, and this was even easier. All you had to do was send 2 synthetic mouse down events. So think about it. Programmatically, when you want to generate a mouse click, you send a mouse down event, and then you send a mouse up event. And this mimics the user clicking the mouse down and then the mouse up. And this bug was discovered by myself rather hilariously accidentally. I was copying and pasting some code, and I forgot to update the flag in the second event to say this is an up event. So when I compiled and ran this code, I hadn't realized what I had done, and I sent 2 mouse down events to the system. Now, obviously, this doesn't make any sense. The system says, you've just given me 2 mouse down events. This should be essentially illegal. Unfortunately, instead of discarding that, what it kindly did was translated that second mouse down event to a mouse up event, and then delivered it. And again, the system would then examine that mouse click and say, oh, yeah, it came from the system, because the system was the one doing the translation from that mouse down event to a mouse up event. So again, this would be allowed, this would be approved, and this would allow us to click arbitrarily on security and privacy alerts. Now, Apple, understandably so, got rather annoyed with me continually breaking this mechanism, and so they said, okay, screw this. Let's simply block all synthetic clicks. Let's not try to filter out because Patrick keeps breaking this. Let's just say, no, there's not a lot of good reasons to generate synthetic clicks, so let's just block all of them. So now, for example, on Mojave, if you run a piece of Apple script that tries to generate a click, this will just be flat out blocked. Similarly, if you use some of the APIs to generate synthetic clicks, Apple doesn't filter these anymore, it just says no. And it displays an alert that says, hey, we've blocked this. And if the user wants to explicitly allow that application, they have to now enter that password and explicitly approve it. So when I first saw this, I said, okay, game over. This is the right approach. This is Apple taking a very draconian but good approach that seems to say game over for these synthetic clicks. Unfortunately, that was not the case. Not to pick on Apple too much, but if history has shown me anything, it's often their initial attempts to get things right fail. So now let's talk about a flaw in macOS that allowed us to generate synthetic mouse clicks as a normal user in an invisible manner that could bypass the majority of Apple's security and privacy mechanisms. First, we need to understand some operating system internals. So behind the scenes, there is an Apple daemon called TCCD, which is largely responsible for handling consent and control. This is what the CC in TCCD stands for. So for example, when you launch an application or an application attempts to perform an action like accessing the mic or the webcam, or yes, generating a synthetic event, TCCD will go and check a system database to see if that application has been approved. And this database is called tcc.db. So the other day I was poking around on the internet and I stumbled across a blog written by Howard Oakley, and in one of his posts he noted that this daemon has an undocumented secondary check. And in his blog post he said it also goes and checks an approved list of applications. And this is now conceptually illustrated on the slide. So basically, what actually goes on behind the scenes is when an application is launched and wants to perform some action, for example, accessing the webcam, which is blocked, the operating system will first check TCCDB to see if the user has previously approved that. If not, it goes and, apparently according to Howard, checks some other database, which is undocumented, to see perhaps if there is a rule in that database that gives that application access. This to me was intriguing, right? Anytime there's undocumented functionality, dig deeper. So the first thing we want to do is we need to figure out where this second database lies, because I want to know what's in this database. Can we subvert it? Is there something we can abuse here? Turns out it's pretty easy to find this database. If we look at the property list, or plist, for the TCCD, the TCC daemon, we can see there is an entry to watch a file named allowed applications list. This file is also exclusively opened by TCCD. This seems likely to be the actual database. So if we take a peek at this file, we can see that it's a property list containing popular applications, such as the VLC video player, that are afforded, or rather pre-approved, the ability to perform actions that would otherwise be blocked or generate an alert. Looking at this property list, we can see that Apple defines two types of allowed actions. The first one is Apple scripts, and the second one is post-event. This means you can post an event. So for each entry, Apple has included the application's code signing information, and as we'll see, this is so that Apple can validate that the application has not been subverted or is in a pristine state. So again, the idea of this list is a way to kind of whitelist or pre-approve popular applications that have legitimate reasons to, for example, generate synthetic clicks. So here, for example, VLC is one of those applications. I have no idea why, but Apple, in their infinite wisdom, said VLC has the ability to generate synthetic clicks. We don't want to annoy the users or break this application because it's so popular and so widespread. So we're just going to pre-approve it. So even if we have a new rule that says you cannot generate synthetic events, VLC will still be able to. So our goal then is to put on my hacker hat and wonder, could I subvert any of these applications in this pre-approved allowed application list? Because if we can subvert one of these pre-approved trusted applications, in theory, we should now still be able to generate synthetic clicks in a way that will always be loud, because they are pre-approved. Okay, so time to take a closer look at the TCC daemon's validation logic of those pre-approved applications. So I dove into the daemon and started reverse engineering, and after a while, I came across a method named matches code requirement data. This takes an access identity object and the code signing information, or in Apple's parlance, the code signing requirement of the app from the allowed application list. And if we look at strings in the code, which I've included on the slide, we can see that it appears to ensure that the code signing information matches and verifies what it's there. So in other words, Apple is saying, okay, you might claim to be VLC, but we're going to make really sure that this is VLC signed by the VLC developer and that it has not been tampered with, which makes sense. This is what they should be doing. So if we take a closer look at this access identity class, we can see that when it's instantiated, it contains information about the application attempting the action. No surprise here, right? They basically create an object that represents the application, and then what they're going to do is they're going to check to make sure that that's in the list and everything matches. So for example, we take a look at vlc.app, which recall is one of those trusted pre-approved applications. And if we attach a runtime debugger to the TCC daemon, we can debug and step through. And if we dump the access identity object, we can see, as expected, is VLC's name, path, and other information. So if we dive into the matches code requirement method, we can see it invokes a standard Apple code signing API that attempts to verify that the application is still signed, and as I noted, signed by the specified code signing requirement, which is also stored in that allowed application database property list. So far, everything looks great. I mean, if I designed this, I would do it in a similar way. It looks that Apple is trying to cryptographically verify that only the applications in this pre-approved list can be pre-approved to generate, for example, synthetic clicks. Unfortunately, though, as is often the case, the devil is in the details. So as Apple's documentation states, these code signing APIs can be controlled or influenced by the flag parameter. So if we look at the disassembly and take a close look at the flag, we can see that the application verification is performed with a flag set to 7. This is a bitwise OR of various values, which we can break out. So if we do that, and we can see those values on the slide, we can see that this is destructed into 3 separate values. The first is check all architectures. That's good. You can have a fat binary with 32-bit code and 64-bit code. So this says, please validate all those architectures. The second two left me scratching my head. The first one is do not validate the executable. And then the third one is do not validate the resources. This is kind of problematic because since Apple is effectively saying, don't worry about validating the executable nor its resources, we can basically confirm by looking at Apple's code signing logic that, yes, indeed, neither the executable code of these pre-approved applications nor their resources are going to be validated. This is kind of a problem. So as neither the application's executable or its resources are validated, it's actually incredibly trivial to subvert any of these pre-approved or allowed applications and add code that will generate synthetic clicks on our behalf. As we can see on the slide, we can do this in a few very simple steps. So here's an example. What we're now going to do is we're going to step through showing how to subvert VLC, one of the pre-approved applications. We're going to show that it's still approved, it still validates, even though we've injected malicious code, and ultimately allows us to generate arbitrary synthetic events that are still allowed by macOS. So first, we need to find a way for VLC to execute and load code for us. So it turns out the VLC supports the ability to load arbitrary plugins. So we say, OK, let's just create a plugin and see if VLC loads it. So as we can see on the slide, there's some code from VLC, and there's a debugger screenshot of us debugging VLC. We can see, yes, indeed, VLC will load our plugin. This is not too surprising. This is how plugin architectures work. Now, the real test is, can the malicious plugin generate a synthetic click that is allowed by macOS? More specifically, does VLC as a process, even with this malicious plugin now loaded, pass the match code requirement data check? The answer, as shown on the slide, is yes. And again, this is due to the fact that the flags Apple passed to the code signing APIs said, don't validate the executable or resources. Resources include plugins. So basically, they don't validate any of the plugins. All right, so now we're going to show a brief demo. In this demo, we'll see that system integrity protection has been disabled. We're going to try to load a rootkit. This is going to be blocked because, as we mentioned at the beginning of the talk, macOS now blocks the loading of kernel extensions until the user explicitly clicks Allow. However, using the bypass we just described, we can send a synthetic mouse click to the Allow button and click Allow, which basically tells the operating system, yeah, sure, go ahead and allow this rootkit to load. So we can see this is 10.14.3. This was the version of macOS at the time. We can see that system integrity protection has been disabled. We're going to do a kexstat command to show that the rootkit no has not been loaded already. We then try to load this, and you have to, again, be root, as always, to load a kernel extension. We can see this failed, and it says the user has not approved this. We now generate or execute our attack. Behind the scenes, this is launching VLC and generating a synthetic click on the allow button. We now run the kexstat command again, and we can see that the rootkit has been allowed to load because the system has been faked out because we masqueraded as the user. All right, now we need to talk about something because in all honesty, that demo didn't actually show the whole picture. If we had captured the entire screen, we would have seen a pop-up being generated, basically saying, hey, a kernel extension is trying to load. We would have seen the mouse moving by itself, clicking the allow button, and then the kernel extension being loaded. So think about this for a second. Imagine you're sitting at your computer working hard, or perhaps you're browsing Instagram, looking at pictures of Hawaii, Andy. All of a sudden, a pop-up appears, the mouse moves, and there's a click. Like, toss that computer. You're clearly hacked. So this is kind of problematic. We've been talking about all these synthetic clicks and bypassing all these pop-ups, but if we think about it in reality, if we perform this action as is, the user is going to clearly see that their computer is hacked. So the question, therefore, is how can we perform these attacks in an invisible manner so that the user is not aware that this is actually going on? Turns out, really easy. Basically, we can just dim the screen. This works because when the screen is dimmed, the UI is still fully interactive. You can't see it. Now, if the screen is fully asleep, it's not interactive, so you can't send programmatic, for example, mouse clicks. But as long as it's dimmed and not off, you can interact with pop-ups, show alerts, click buttons, and obviously the user's not going to be able to see that. So all the attacker has to do is first dim the screen, then perform the action, which will generate the pop-up, then send the synthetic click to approve and allow the action. Now we can see on the slide, it's pretty trivial to dim the screen. It's about 10 lines of code. However, we still have a problem. So again, imagine you're working on your computer, and all of a sudden the screen randomly dims, and then 5 seconds later undims. You might not think you're hacked, but you'll probably dig around. This is still something odd, right? And as attackers or malware, we really want to be a little more elegant. We want to be a little more sophisticated. So again, let's address this. So there's two things we can do. First, we can simply wait until the user is inactive, and then we can dim the screen and perform the full attack. Turns out there's a beautiful API you can call, CG event source second since last event, and this will give you the number of seconds since the user has interacted with the computer. For example, moving the mouse, typing on the keyboard, or using the computer in any other way. So what you can do is you can just sit in a loop and call this API, and then it will give you, again, the number of seconds that have elapsed since the last user activity. And you can set whatever threshold you want. This can be 10 seconds, 30 seconds, 5 minutes, an hour. And basically, then what you can do is you can wait until that threshold is hit. And you can say, OK, it's been 60 seconds. The user is likely not using their keyboard. And then you can dim the screen and perform the attack. In this case, even if the user is sitting in front of the computer but not using their computer, if after, say, 5 minutes the screen dims, they'll probably just assume that their display is going to sleep. But turns out we can actually do even better. So when the display legitimately is going to sleep, for example, when the system has determined the user has been inactive, depending on their settings, this actually is a process that we can hijack. So when the system decides the display should go to sleep, it does a few actions prior to that. So first, it broadcasts a message, dims the screen to 50%, then waits a few seconds before broadcasting another method, fully dimming the screen. Then and only then it puts the display to sleep. So what we can do is we can register for this first message that's broadcast, the KIO message can device power off message. And when we see this, we know we have a few seconds before the display is going to sleep, and that the system is already dimming the screen. So what we can do is we can just hop into this process, slightly speed it up, and dim it fully to 100% in that first step. Now the screen is fully black, so we can perform our own action. For example, trying to load the kernel extension, generating the synthetic click to click allow, and then we can allow the screen to go fully asleep. Since we're essentially hijacking the legitimate screen going to sleep process already, the user is not going to detect anything is amiss. So we've achieved full invincibility. OK, so let's wrap some of this up. First, I really want to stress, or rather re-stress, the power of synthetic events. If once you've gained access to a system, if you have the ability to programmatically or synthetically interact with a UI, you can bypass a myriad of largely unrelated security and privacy mechanisms with a single click. That's an incredibly powerful capability. Also, and not to pick on Apple too much, because I am somewhat fond of them, the truth is their track record against protecting against some of these attacks is not all it could be. But to be fair, this is rather a difficult problem, as they always have to balance usability and security. And that's never an easy thing to do. So Apple can't just go out and say we're going to block all synthetic events, because there's a lot of popular applications that perhaps have been written rather poorly or legitimately need to use synthetic clicks, and Apple is, understandably so, not going to break all these popular apps. It's good news for us as hackers or attackers, because often we can exploit and leverage this kind of misbalance between usability and security to continue to perform previously disallowed actions. Now also, and again, not to pick on Apple too much, Apple likes to spend a lot of time marketing, right? They get up on stage and in a keynote basically say, we have a fix. And that's great, but if we actually look, as we showed in this presentation, how this fix was implemented, it really should have never made it to production code. I mean, it's a neat bug, but if anyone at Apple had actually looked at this code and looked at it from a security point of view, they'd have very quickly discovered that this was a problem. And I always like to think that, if I can find this bug, there's bad people out there, there's APT groups, nation-state hackers, that are way more sophisticated, way more resourced, and likely are going to find these bugs as well. But there is some good news. Apple has already mitigated this bug, so kudos to Apple. And also, even more news, Apple has recently announced the launching of a macOS bug bounty program. That's coming soon. I'm really excited about this because I passionately believe that this is a great step in the right direction that will bring more security researchers to look for these bugs on the platform. Because if we really think about it, we're kind of all in this together. And the end result is macOS will be more secure, which will benefit users throughout the world. Now, in the meantime, if there's still other ways to bypass this, or perhaps you're extra concerned about these synthetic clicks, or you're running on an older version of macOS because your users are not updating, you might want to figure out how to either prevent or detect these synthetic clicks yourself. So the first thing let's talk about, kind of in conclusion, is how to programmatically prevent these synthetic clicks in your own application. So imagine you're writing a firewall application that will detect unauthorized network action. Obviously, if you detect a piece of malware making an unauthorized connection, you really don't want that malware to be able to send a synthetic click to your alert to just allow the action, right? You want to be able to prevent that. Turns out that's actually pretty easy to do, again, in your own application code. What you can do is you can subclass the mouse down event method, and this will be invoked anytime a click is delivered to your application. This gives you the ability to examine this click and tell the system if you want to handle it or not. So what you can do is, when this message is delivered to you, part of the information about the mouse click is whether or not it was synthetically generated. So Apple actually tells you there's a flag in the click event that is going to be set to 0 if it's programmatically or synthetically generated. If it's generated via the user, it's going to be set to 1. So as you can see on the slide, in our custom mouse down event, we examine the process ID, and we basically say if this process is running as root or it belongs to Apple, we will allow it. The logic is actually inverted, so in this case, we say if it's not from Apple or not running as root, we are going to block it. And the way you block it is you just return from this function, and that will effectively discard or ignore the event. If you decide that this event is okay, you simply call the superclasses mouse down method, and this will call back up into the Objective-C runtime and let the click proceed. So again, this gives you your own ability to filter mouse clicks. Now, you might want to generically detect synthetic clicks globally on the system. Turns out, this is pretty easy to do as well. So what you can do is you register something called an event tap. And once you have registered an event tap, anytime a mouse click is generated, either by the user or synthetically in any capacity, any of the attacks or techniques we described, your event tap will be invoked with all the information about the click. What process generated it, the XY coordinates, and most importantly, whether or not it was synthetically generated. So here we have code. Again, to do this, we can see in our event callback, we call the getIntegerValue field method, and this will return a 0 or a 1. If it's set to 0, this means this event has been synthetically generated. So one of the tools we created at Digita was an enterprise security product, and we included this exact code because we decided that it would probably be interesting to log and perhaps alert anytime we detected a synthetic event. Because if you think about it, especially perhaps in the enterprise, there's really not a lot of reason why synthetic clicks or programmatic mouse clicks should be generated. So this meant that with no a priori knowledge, we could actually detect the attack I described today, because we almost didn't care how you generated a synthetic click. If you trick the system into doing it, if you subvert VLC, basically said, hey, we're just going to log an alert on the fact that a synthetic click was generated. And actually, that's not that difficult to do. All right, great. So that's a wrap. Hopefully today I've illustrated the power of synthetic clicks and showed that if you find a way to generate these clicks, you can often undermine a ton of local security and privacy mechanisms. On a personal note, I want to thank the Friends of Objective-C, which sponsor a lot of my research. And of course, I want to thank you and the Ekoparty organization and conference for putting on what I think is the best security conference in the world. So let's give everyone a round of applause. So I think we have a minute or two for questions. If not, if I get kicked off the stage, I will be around. I love to nerd out and talk about this. So feel free to come and chat with me. And I speak a little bit of Spanish as well. So if you speak Spanish, we can figure something out. So again, thank you.
Come on.
No preguntas?